NATO leaders are gathering in Washington as we speak and getting ready for the opening of the 75th anniversary summit meeting in Washington, D.C., where the whole NATO began in 1949. And President Joe Biden is busy getting his speech together where he's going to have a big address as part of this big ceremony that all the world will be watching from, and probably a lot for not the right reasons. But there's a lot of anticipation over just exactly how that speech is going to go and what he's going to say. But while that's going on, there are other things going on around the world, and even within and amongst the NATO alliance that the alliance leaders are probably not wanting you to know much about. But we are going to unpack that today, and there's nobody better to do that with than Ambassador Chaz Freeman, friend of this show, former part of the Department of Defense, state, a former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and just a great all-around person. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back to our show.
Thank you, Danny. You're flattering me to the point where I may be too embarrassed to stick around.
Okay, well, then I'll stop. Won't do any more of that. Boy, I tell you, I don't know if you're going to be shocked by some of the stuff that I'm showing, but I was surprised by some of the comments that I have assembled for this, and that some of which Gary found, which I had even not seen, which makes events of the recent past and the recent days even more poignant. And I think altogether, this is starting to paint a picture that Western civilization, if I can use that phrase because someone in one of our clips is going to use it, is starting to fray. And I think that as you and I have talked about on several different episodes, you've been on our show about the rules-based order and how a lot of that's just coming apart at the seams, and what we want to accomplish are increasingly disconnected from reality. But there are others in the world that seem to be connected to reality, and I'm not sure that's working in a good direction for us. But let's get right to it. So first of all, I want to show just a little piece of something that President Biden said in his ABC News interview last Friday, where he was supposed to dispel all the concerns that everybody had based on his performance in the debate the previous Thursday. And this doesn't really address whether he's answering those concerns, but it actually raises an even bigger worry for me.
You know, not only am I campaigning, but I'm running the world. And that's not how it sounds like hyperbole. But we are the essential nation in the world. Madeleine Albright was right.
That actually goes beyond Madeleine Albright's "we're the indispensable nation" to running the world. I don't think that got enough interest, and I just wonder what your reaction is when you saw that.
Well, I'd say several things. First, that may have been true briefly after the end of the Cold War. It is emphatically not true now, and very few people out there in the world want the United States to run their affairs for them. That's not the trend. The trend is quite the opposite. It is toward, as I've said before, a multinodal, distributed, shifting set of balances of power in which the United States is consistently losing rather than gaining influence. So this is hubris. It's delusional. It's very disturbing. I don't think it represents the American people. I don't think the American people want to run the world. I think we want to run our own affairs. And of course, the big question that you alluded to everyone watching the NATO speech for is, okay, all the talks about can Mr. Biden beat Mr. Trump? That's about the campaign. Can this man govern for 4 years more? Is he governing now? Or, this is the real question we ought to be asking. So if he's running the world, really, that probably explains why the world is such a goddamn mess.
Fair enough. And in fact, one of the statements he made this morning on Morning Joe on MSNBC, I think just kind of highlights, again, more of the delusion in my view. Check this out.
Who else do you think could step in here and do this? I expanded NATO. I solidified NATO. Ask your brother about it in Poland. I made sure that we're in a position where we have a coalition of people, of the nations around the world to deal with China, with Russia, with everything that's going on in the world. We're making real progress. The Biden plan, which got in Israel for the Gaza Strip, is something that was adopted by the UN Security Council. Whether it comes to fruition, it's awful close. We'll see. G7's okay. But look, yeah. I'm not going to explain any more about what I should or shouldn't do. I am running.
Two things jumped out at me from there. First of all, where he's boasting about how he's dominating China and Russia. We're going to get into a little bit more of that. But then he wants to highlight the Biden plan for Israel. I'm not sure that's something you want to advertise.
I wouldn't think so, especially not to young people in our country who are disgusted by a policy that this president has adopted of wholehearted support for genocide. I was very struck today, The Lancet, which is the most respected British medical journal, known for its investigative capacity, says that the number of dead Palestinians has been grossly underestimated, and that is probably 186,000.
Whoa.
This coming at the same time that the Congress, at the instance of the Israel lobby, is trying to pass a law to ban the use of casualty and death figures put out by the Palestinian Health Ministry, which of course reports to Hamas. Well, it turns out the Palestinian Health Ministry has probably been grossly undercounting the number of dead. That is not a positive talking point for this president. And as for bringing NATO together, he spoke at the very moment that Mr. Orban was back from Moscow and on his way to Beijing, representing quite a trend in NATO of fatigue and desire to end the war. Mr. Orban reminded everybody with his trip to Moscow that NATO was formed as a defensive alliance. Its purpose, which it achieved, was to stabilize Europe and prevent a war there. But NATO is now meeting in Washington to concert an offensive posture to prosecute a war beyond the borders of its members and to double down on preparing Ukraine to be a threat to Russia. This is an achievement. Pushing Russia and China together is an achievement. Adopting policies toward Russia that have just brought Russia into the realm of high-income countries for the first time. Russia has never been in that category. The Russian economy is doing exceedingly well. We are trying to produce regime change in Moscow. We have not succeeded in that. We're trying to produce regime change in China, and we're not succeeding in that. We have tried to produce regime change in Iran, and we've just had a liberal Iranian president elected. But if we're true to form, we won't talk to him. Yeah. This picture, which you're watching, Mr. Orban talking to Putin, is really interesting because no European has talked to Mr. Putin. No American has talked to Mr. Putin for over 2 years. And while Orban does not represent a consensus in the EU by any means, he has succeeded in restoring communication with Russia. And without communication, you have no alternative to the battlefield. Are we interested in alternatives to battlefields, or do we want more of them? That is the question.
And I think that you made a good point here, which I'm going to illustrate in just a second, that there are more people, and while there's not a consensus in either the European Union or NATO right now towards that end, it's growing, and the rift and the divide between NATO is starting to grow. And before I show you some of the things that Orban has been saying here of late, or some of the specific other things that are going on with it, I want to show you something that almost nobody saw here in the United States from this past March that Gary actually found, in which Orban really lays out in extremely graphic terms what's motivating him right now. Check this out.
Idén, ha az Úristen is úgy akarja, lezárhatjuk a nyugati civilizáció egy dicstelen korszakát. Lezárhatjuk a progresszív, liberális hegemóniára épülő világrendet. Barátaim, a progresszív, liberális világszellem úgy, ahogy van, elbukott. Háborúkat, káoszt és békétlenséget, összeomló gazdaságot és zűrzavart hozott a világra. Zűrzavart a nemzetközi politikában, elszegényedést a családoknak, romló közbiztonságot az utcákon és a tereken. Furcsa korszak és különös szellem volt ez. Beszéljünk egyenesen, ez a világrend olyan vezetőket termelt ki, akik nem valók vezetőknek, akik alkalmatlanok a feladatra, akik hibára halmoznak, és végül a saját vesztükbe rohannak.
Now we can probably debate on who he was talking about there, or who he had in mind when he said Western leaders are failing, but there's a pretty short list and a lot of evidence to support his views.
And there have been a very large number of turnovers in elections. The repudiation of leaders, most recently in Britain. France is a bit of an anomaly because the voters first repudiated Macron and then repudiated the right wing in France, Madame Le Pen. But he has a point, and I think there would be probably a fair number of Americans who agreed with everything he said, which is why we have Donald Trump running apparently successfully for the presidency again.
But I mean, I just think it's a bigger issue than some recognize, because it shatters this view of seeming unity among some of the Western leaders that we're running the show, that we're setting the global debate on really anything, that we set the standards, we make the rules, as you refer to sometimes, and yet this shows that there's more and more leaders that are starting to say this is not working. It is not helping us. It's not producing a better world. It's not producing a better country. And he is clearly now with action showing he wants to see a change.
I think if you're European and you look at the war in Ukraine, which he does because he's a neighbor of Ukraine, he has issues with Ukraine. Hungary is a country that has been allied with the German Nazis and allied with the Soviet Union, but both cases unwillingly. Mr. Orban is an interesting person. He used to be criticized for being anti-Soviet, anti-Russian. Now he's criticized for being pro-Russian. I don't think he is. I think he's pro-Hungarian and pro-European, and I believe he sees his country, Hungary's, interests as resting with the expansion of peace. He's in NATO. NATO, as I said, was a very successful defensive alliance. I think he would like it to go back to being defensive rather than offensive. And he's joined in this, by the way, with Mr. Fico, the prime minister in Slovakia, who has just emerged from recovery from the assassination attempt that was made on him. So we have a great clamor against these men. Orban, Fico, they're condemned right and left by people who want to continue the war. But those people have no answer to how to end the war.
Right.
And he does. He's just put himself as the president of the European Union for 6 months in a unique position. He has talked to Mr. Putin. He has talked to Mr. Xi Jinping, who has put forward a set of principles for peace in Eastern Europe that are very hard to object to. He clearly is going to try to use his EU presidency as best he can to promote war termination. Now, you might condemn that.
I guess if you're for war, you might condemn it. Gary, McGill, a little bit out of order here. Let's go ahead and play that video. If this is what Orban said earlier today, it's part of a kind of a commercial, so to speak. Has a lot of music in the background, so we kind of stripped that out. But I'll just read some of the text underneath that, because then I'm going to get into the ramifications of why he's doing this and what's happening around that. Gary, if you can roll that. He said, my meeting with Xi Jinping has just ended. Of course, the warring parties have the last word in the war, but the three world powers have a decisive influence: China, the United States, and the European Union. They also influence when this war will end. After my meeting with the warring parties, this is why I have come here to Beijing. We discussed the Chinese peace plan with President Xi. China is the only world power that has been clearly committed to peace from the beginning. This is important for Hungary, for the entire European Union. President Xi has made it clear today that he will continue his efforts aimed at creating peace. We are not alone. We will continue our work. And I just think that it's really illustrative, really, to kind of do bolster the points you just made there, that he's like, this is Hungary's best interest. This is even Europe's best interest, because, and we won't show it right now, but he's said many times public forums that he's basing this because he said there is no viable path for Ukraine to ever win a war here. And so there's no more value at all in even trying. So let's go to peace.
Yeah, I mean, he's been very consistent. And he's clearly odd man out in the war coalition. The fact that Mr. Biden can, as part of the interview that he gave, I don't think you showed the clip, said he's running wars all over the world, he said. Well, that's true. Is that an achievement? Is that something we should be happy with? I would say that the Pax Americana, which NATO was a major feature of, used to keep the peace in Europe, but there's no peace in Europe now, there's a war. Used to keep the peace in the Middle East, the American influence, but now it doesn't. There's a war, and we're part of it. We are verging on a war with China. This is not a healthy set of policies for the United States to pursue. And I think Mr. Trump, to his credit, has objected to these policies. He says he will end the war in Ukraine in one day. I have no idea how we will do that, or whether he can, or whether this is just the usual campaign bluster that our politicians are so good at. He clearly has said nothing about the war in the Middle East because he's very much a prisoner of powerful donors who are supporters of Israel. And I don't know what his position is on the Taiwan issue in China. He clearly has a program, anti-China program, devised by various likely members of his cabinet. Lighthizer, for example, was widely rumored to be the next Secretary of the Treasury. And this would be a huge tariff increase, which most economists think would throw the United States into the economic equivalent of a heart attack. But, maybe the economists don't know anything. And as Mr. Trump says, he's a very stable genius. He may know more than the economists do.
Or maybe he won't do that. I mean, we'll have to.
Or maybe he won't do that.
Yeah.
We see politicians elected. Keir Starmer in the UK once said he would recognize an independent Palestinian state. He gets elected and he said, "No, I won't do that." What are campaign promises worth? A lot less than Confederate currency, I would say.
A lot less. That's kind of embarrassing. I want to now kind of slightly shift gears to some of the ramifications of this, what I consider basically delusional thinking, that we can keep going down these paths, that we can ignore what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, and we can still just plunge ahead, that NATO can keep going here on its 75th anniversary and provide a bridge to NATO enlargement with Ukraine, despite all the things that have happened over the last 2.5 years. There are specific consequences to that. And I want to show you just a few comments here because Putin and Xi have just met with the the Shanghai Cooperation Organization just a few days back. And here's a couple of the comments that Putin said, and then one that Xi Jinping said. And I would like you to comment on each one. Here's the first one that Putin said.
Наши страны наращивают использование во взаимных расчетах национальной валюты. Например, их доля в коммерческих операциях России с участниками организации по итогам первых 4 месяцев текущего года уже превысила 92%. Напомню о российском предложении заняться созданием собственного платежно-расчетного механизма.
So he's talking about creating a new payment mechanism, which is trying to continue to erode the power of the dollar. How serious is that effort?
And that effort is very serious. It's aimed to come to fruition in the meeting at Kazan of the BRICS group, which is expanding, of course. And it's not expanding simply in terms of membership, but it's becoming an actual trade bloc. If you look, for example, at Brazil, which is the B in BRICS, its dependence on China is skyrocketing. So Russian dependence on China similarly is skyrocketing. Even India and China, which have a tense relationship and a border problem, are accelerating their economic interdependence. All this is going on while we're pretending that, we're the center of the world, we're running the world, and everything is just the way it was, and we dominate everything. That's not true. We're in a situation where, if you remember the story about Galileo, when he was called to the Pope and told to recant his theory that the Earth went around the sun rather than the opposite, under his breath he said, "Eppur si muove," and yet it does that. After he had, affirmed that no, the sun goes around the moon, around the Earth, he said, "Eppur si muove," but no, in fact, it's the opposite. And we're confronted again and again with absolutely absurd assertions. I look at this, the press spokespeople we have, the State Department asked, has there been restraint in Rafah, in Gaza? And they say, well, yeah, we think so. And, then somebody goes in there and they see there's not a single building left. And not any people either, And so we have gained a reputation for gross distortion of the facts. The sad thing is that most of our media seem to be entirely comfortable marching in lockstep with the official narratives, which are lies. So we have, and I would say Mr. Biden's condition is an example of this. We've been told for 3 years, oh, no, he's sharp as a tack, and he's on top of everything, and so on and so forth. Now we see, I'm familiar, I did presidential advances and advancing trips by presidents in the past, so I know that they're very carefully choreographed. But there's just been a story, I think it was in Axios, showing the cards that Biden gets before he goes to it onto a stage. Photos of how you get to the dais and where the door is and where the podium is, and so forth. This wouldn't be necessary for somebody who was in decent condition. So yeah, there's the story in the Telegraph. I think what is happening is perhaps not quite as extreme as Mr. Orban says in terms of the collapse of Western civilization, but maybe there's something to that. And I'm reminded, by the way, of the wonderful comment that Mahatma Gandhi made when he arrived in London, and he was asked what he thought of Western civilization. And he said he thought it would be a good idea.
Yeah, as opposed to what he saw. Okay, moving on to the next one here, because this is kind of expanding on something that you also alluded to a little bit here with both the SCO and with the BRICS and where that's going. But Putin is talking about how they're expressly looking to create a new multipolar order. Here's what he said.
Стал реальностью. Ширится круг государств, выступающих за справедливое мироустройство и готовых решительно отстаивать свои законные права и защищать традиционные ценности. Появляются и укрепляются новые центры силы и экономического роста. Убеждены, что Шанхайская организация сотрудничества наряду с БРИКС являются основными опорами нарождающегося нового миропорядка.
So he's talking about the emerging global order. And now that, as you say, and I wonder if you could actually expand a little bit on that, on what's supposed to happen. I think it's in October with the BRICS. How significant is that? And how is that going to shift the balance of economic power?
Well, to begin with, the BRICS meeting in Kazan, which is a Muslim part of Russia, is probably going to be attended by 100 different countries. That is, countries that are interested in either joining the BRICS or coordinating with it. What was the BRICS in the beginning? It was basically a protest movement against American hegemony. It's grown into something much bigger than that. And so this is a very significant meeting, even if they don't manage to put together the alternative currency trade settlement arrangements that they are aiming to do. There's increasing talk, by the way, that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, and the BRICS will merge down the way. And Mr. Putin has talked about a Eurasia-wide cooperative security system, something that would unite everything from Portugal to Korea in a single framework dedicated to keeping the peace within that space. This is multilateral. I would say it's multinodal, multipolar if you want. As you know, I don't like polar because it's basically a line between 2 points. And the geometry is now a lot more complicated than that, as the cast of characters that was listening or sleeping through Mr. Putin's talk illustrates. So I think we're seeing the emergence of a world in which there's no automatic deference to our will anymore. And there isn't even that among our allies, as we've discussed before.
I want to show you something because it's kind of an intersection here. Something that Biden said a little while back about what he wants to accomplish. And on one of his more lucid moments, he said with a lot of gusto, this.
We don't walk away from our allies. We stand with them. We don't let tyrants win. We oppose them. We don't merely watch global events unfold. We shape them. That's what it means to be the indispensable nation. That's what it means to be the world's superpower and the world's leading democracy.
So in light of what that image there that Gary just showed about the BRICS that's coming up and about how many you mentioned that could potentially up to 100 nations could at least be participating in some form, that doesn't seem like you're shaping events, or if it does, it's shaping in a way that's not good for our side.
Well, there are international reactions to what is perceived to be very outrageous behavior by the United States, starting in Gaza, but also embracing Ukraine. Let's remember that while Europeans have been fairly united in support of Ukraine, not entirely, but fairly united, they have been separated from the rest of the world. The rest of the world, 4/5 of the world that isn't in our sphere, is dissents. They don't follow us. So if you're a leader and nobody follows you, what kind of leadership is that?
Yeah, are you actually leading anything? By definition, the answer would seem to be no. But okay, so that was Vladimir Putin. On the other side of that meeting, there was Xi Jinping, who added this.
当前，双方正在全面落实我们达成的各项共识，推动两国各领域合作沿着既定轨道稳步前进。面对变乱交织的国际形势和外部环境， 双方要继续秉持世代友好的初心，坚守造福人民的恒心，不断涵养中俄关系的独特价值，挖掘两国合作的内生动力，为维护两国正当权益、捍卫国际关系基本准则做出努力。
So if I could back it up to prior to the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia and China had been getting closer, but they maybe were like this. Now it seems like it's getting closer and closer, and our actions keep pushing them closer together. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the motivations of China, what they want to get, what they're exploiting, and where they want to carry this relation in terms of its countering American actions.
Well, this Chinese government is no different in many respects from the previous 4,000 years of Chinese governments. They all look to establish peace on their borders. They don't want enemies on their borders. We shouldn't either. Russia and China have an enormously long border, and they have a very tangled history, as we've discussed before, including a lot of fighting. And the Chinese definitely want to be on the good side of Russia. And also Russia has a lot to contribute to China. It is a storehouse, a treasure house of natural resources. And China is now producing well over a third of the world's industrial products. It needs metals and minerals and energy and all these things Russia has. Russia also has advanced technology. And sadly, the Russians, I've learned a great deal in the war with Ukraine about new kinds of warfare, those involving drones, for example, transparent battlefields where no movement goes undetected, a whole lot of new developments, relatively speaking, in warfare. And the Chinese have a great deal to learn from them in that regard, and they're trying assiduously to do that. So this is a relationship that, from the Chinese point of view, is both defensive, we don't want the Russians against us, and very beneficial, very profitable. From the Russian point of view, it's a vital relationship because we have pushed the Russians out of Europe, in effect, and driven them into the arms of the Chinese, the Indians. As we speak, the Indian foreign minister is, or Mr. Modi, actually, the prime minister, is visiting Moscow. This is an illustration of how much the world has changed. We have constant visits between Beijing and Moscow, Delhi and Moscow, Riyadh and Moscow. And we never go to Moscow. We don't talk to the Russians. When Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, calls his counterpart to say that we didn't mean to do that massacre on the beach in Sevastopol, this is big news, because not what he said, but that we actually talked to the Russians.
Yeah.
This is crazy. So we have I'd say the United States has a tremendous strategies deficit. We don't know how to think strategically anymore, and we're diplomatically incompetent. The basic principle of diplomacy, which Mr. Orban has just illustrated, which the Chinese illustrated in their crafting of rapprochement between Riyadh and Tehran, is you got to talk to everybody. You don't have to agree with them. You can talk to them and politely explain why you disagree with them. That's very important. But you have to show them respect, because when it comes down to the moment where you need them, and you always do at some point, if you have a terrible relationship, they're not going to lift a finger to help you. And they won't even listen to you. And we're at the point where we have a Secretary of State who listens to no one and lectures everybody, and a president who doesn't communicate with the people we're fighting with, and therefore has no plan to end the fighting. We're going to go on for as long as it takes, he says. What does that mean?
Right.
We run out of Ukrainians?
Yeah.
That is when all Palestinians have been exterminated. What is it? It's not a strategy. It's nothing. It's just rhetoric, but with terrible consequences.
Now, it also seems to me that aside from bringing, some of our erstwhile adversaries closer together and moving in directions that are antithetical to our interests, it also seems to be shredding a little bit even the Western European unity. Now, we've talked a lot about Orban, but he's not the only one. We also have Bulgaria. Is actually, I think this was as of Friday,
Right.
their acting prime minister. So heading into this celebratory 75th anniversary NATO summit, they're saying, "Hey, we're advocating for peace summaries." Their president actually had a pretty strong statement. I think that the head of state does not agree with certain provisions of the framework positions adopted by the Council of Ministers regarding the obligations of our country undertakes in connection with the war in Ukraine. The message said. Then, of course, Turkey, even their foreign minister announced that they want to see the creation of a peace platform to end the war in Ukraine. You just talked about Fico there, the Slovak leader. He's also saying the same kinds of things. And then outside of Europe, you have, of course, Brazil, who's been an outright advocate for peace for quite some time. So these are lots of nations number one, they represent lots of the population, but even within the alliance heading into this NATO summit, which is probably going to say, hey, we're just going to keep providing more ammunition and weapons for another year. But some are saying, hey, yeah, I don't want to go down that path. How significant is this split within the European, within the Western world? And is it significant? And do you think it could grow?
Yes, I think it is very significant. And yes, it can and will grow because this war has been very bad for Europe. It has done grave damage to the European economy. It has imposed defense burdens on Europe, which it did not want to undertake. And even those countries like Finland, which have recently joined NATO, say, for example, we need China to help us make peace. Well, the implication of that is the United States is not going to make peace, so we need to reach out to China. So our support for endless warfare, for a forever war, in effect, in Ukraine, is not something that Europeans find very attractive. In fact, they find it quite off-putting. Now, Bulgaria, of course, is a frontline state, as is Hungary, as is Slovakia, and so is Finland, in a way. So, by the way, while we were not looking, Belarus, White Russia to the west of Russia, and the north of Ukraine, joined the SCO. So it is now part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And it just had military exercises with the Chinese as part of that. This is not the world that I grew up in, or Mr. Biden grew up in. I think, I've tried to notice how it's changed. I don't see much evidence that he understands how it's changed.
Yeah, that's one of my concerns, that his mental acuity is not limited to just, whether he can string a sentence together, as significant as that is. But those I've heard some questioning whether this small coterie of people that are protecting him, that don't even allow people to get into his inner circle, might not even be giving him the full information here. But one has to wonder to what degree he's going to be able to perform. I'm not even talking about the 4 years that if he won the election. I'm talking about between now and the end of this term.
Well,
I think it's questionable whether he should be able to continue. But one of the last questions I want to ask you here before we let you go is, given the performance during the debate and at the ABC News and what may come at his announcement here with NATO, we'll see. But even if it's fine, if he gets through it without any problem, a lot of the damage has already been done. And as you pointed out earlier, Trump is looking to go in a significantly different direction here. What impact does that have either on the Russian and the Chinese, I guess, this burgeoning escalation outside of the West? And then I'll ask you one question after that, Sue.
Well, I think it has a huge impact. everybody's hedging. Some, like Mr. Netanyahu, is going to come to Washington in 2 weeks and undercut Biden in the Congress by ranting and raving about the inadequacy of his support for Israel, and then go to the White House and see Biden, whose reputation will not be enhanced by that meeting. And some are basically openly looking for the demise of the Biden administration. Others fear the arrival of Mr. Trump as president, but increasingly people expect that. They can read the polls, they can see the difference in physical fitness of the two men. That most of them don't really like Mr. Trump, and they're quite scared of what he might do. And that is causing them, again, to hedge. They're building defense budgets and they're building relationships with each other as a contingency against what Mr. Trump might do. So you put these things together, and you'd have the debate, which was not an advertisement for democracy. We claim we are the great representative of democracy and people should emulate us. I don't think anyone wants to see their leadership selected in the manner that so-called debate revealed. It wasn't a debate, of course, it was a press conference with two hostile parties, whose hostility didn't extend to any significant policy differences. It was just donkeys and elephants going at each other. So, I think what you're seeing is in the run-up to the NATO summit is a lot of people saying, hey, what Orban said. Hey, wait a minute, NATO was supposed to preserve peace. That was its purpose. It was supposed to prevent war. What's it doing gearing up to put an office in Kyiv to help the Ukrainians in a bridge to get into NATO and basically continue the war, but make it direct between NATO and Russia rather than a proxy war? What's all that about? And who's thinking about how to end this war? And his answer is, I, Orban, am. And I have a few other people who are also thinking about this, and I hope there will be more. So he's going to use his position as president of the European Union to advocate peace and to try to be an intermediary between the warring parties. That's what he said in Beijing.
Yeah, I think he's taking a lot of risk by doing this. He's really putting his reputation, credibility on the line by taking risks, because it's obviously angering many in the European Union who have been unafraid to call him out for the "you don't represent us," etc. But I think that he's hedging also, that he sees where this is going. And he's think that he's probably going to end up on the right side of history here, especially when you compare that with here's what Biden says about how he thinks we're viewed around the world.
The idea that somehow we are this failing country. I never heard a president talk like this before. We're the envy of the world. Name me a single major country president who wouldn't trade places with the United States of America for all our problems and all our opportunities. We're the most progressive country in the world in getting things done. We're the strongest country in the world. We're a country in the world who keeps our word, and everybody trusts us, all of our allies, and those who he coddles up to, from Kim Jong-un, who he sends love letters to, and Putin, etc. They don't want to screw around with us.
Everybody respects us, and nobody wants to screw around with us. I'm not sure that that's being held up by the evidence.
Doesn't seem quite accurate to me, and it's frightening in the sense that you can't screw around with reality. Maybe nobody wants to screw with the United States because we seem to be unabashed about killing a lot of people. But really, the dysfunctional Congress, the Supreme Court that's off the rails, the president who's feeble, the border that's not closed, the wars that have no end, the basic dysfunction of our system, the sense that we're in a constitutional crisis and that we keep our word, Really? Tell that to the Russians about NATO enlargement. And tell that to the Chinese about the Taiwan question. Tell that to the Iranians about the nuclear deal. Tell that to anyone about arms control agreements that we repudiated. I think this is just, it's sad, and it's very dangerous.
Wow, that's quite a damning list that you put there, and that's just something right off the cuff. Well, we're going to have to just wait and see how this comes out. I'm going to be, like everybody else, really interested in see how Biden's performance goes at his speech, reading off a teleprompter. We'll see whether he can even do that, because
he's good at the teleprompter. But let me make one final point.
Sure.
He's absolutely right about the fundamentals of the United States. Nobody would trade places with trade their position, our position, their position for ours. Why? We have two wide oceans on either side of us. We have neighbors who are either cowed like the Mexicans or super polite like the Canadians, pose no threat to us. We have a very large economy. We have a remarkably diverse population. We have a long history of self-improvement. All that's true. But that's not we're not taking advantage of those characteristics.
Yeah, there's
to
a whole
maintain
lot
our reputation at present.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of other things that we can do, and let's pray to God we don't squander all of these things by continuing going down a bad road. Well, listen, we really appreciate you. Really do appreciate you to casting some light on some of these things today and giving us a deeper understanding of how these things fit together. We really appreciate you coming on today, Mr. Ambassador.
Thanks, Danny.
And we thank you guys for joining us too. I ask you to stick with us. We got another really good show for you tomorrow. Larry Johnson's going to be back, one of our favorite folks we have here on Daniel Davis Deep Dive, former CIA analyst. We're going to be unpacking some things, probably a lot of whatever comes out of this NATO summit and any of these further actions that come out of the Orban's visits to China or some of these other places. Not going to want to miss that. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you tomorrow on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.